He thought a badge could make him untouchable, but the longest night of his life began with one calm voice saying, "Sir, you're speaking to the wrong woman." The afternoon was heavy with summer heat when Detective Aaron Cole stepped out of the county courthouse and saw her standing alone beneath the awning, perfectly still, holding a slim leather folder against her chest. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another black woman in a navy coat, composed and quiet. The kind of person who did not ask for attention and did not need it. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. Her shoes were polished, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Aaron noticed the details in the way a man like him always noticed details, but not because he respected them. He noticed them the way arrogant people notice anything they think they can use. "You there," he said, glancing at her folder, then at the entrance behind her, as if the building itself belonged to him. "Move along. This is a restricted area." Evelyn looked at him, not startled, not offended, just calmly present, and that quiet composure seemed to irritate him more than defiance would have. Around them, people slowed, sensing the shift in the air, the kind of tension that arrives before anyone speaks loudly enough to name it. A woman on the steps lowered her eyes. A court clerk paused with a stack of files in her hands. The courthouse doors opened and closed behind them with a soft, measured rhythm, as if the building itself were listening. Aaron took one step closer. "I asked you a question," Evelyn answered in a voice so even it almost disappeared into the warm air. "And I heard you." That was all it took for his face to harden. He was used to compliance. He was used to fear disguised as politeness. He was used to people looking down when he entered a room. But Evelyn Brooks did not lower her gaze. She did not fidget. She did not rush to explain herself. She simply stood there in the sunlight as steady as stone, while Aaron began to make assumptions he would later regret. "If you're waiting for someone," he said, "stand over there. You're blocking the entrance." Evelyn glanced toward the courthouse doors, then back at him. "I'm not blocking anything." There was no edge in her tone. No challenge. Just truth. And somehow that made him even more certain he was in control. He let out a short laugh and looked her up and down with the careless arrogance of a man who had spent too long mistaking authority for character. "You people always think you can stand wherever you want," he muttered, not quite under his breath. The words landed in the space between them, like a cold object dropped onto glass. Several witnesses heard him. Nobody spoke. The air tightened. Evelyn's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did a quiet deepening, like a door closing softly somewhere far inside. Imagine standing there hearing that kind of insult in a place built for justice with nowhere to hide your dignity except inside yourself. Aaron did not notice the subtle shift. He was too busy enjoying the feeling of power. He reached for the folder in her hands, expecting her to pull away, expecting resistance, expecting the small victory of humiliating someone who had not earned his respect. But Evelyn did not flinch. She simply held the folder a little tighter and said, "You should think carefully before touching that." Aaron smirked. "Or what?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A flag snapped somewhere above the courthouse steps. A radio crackled from the patrol car at the curb. Inside the building, a distant gavel sounded once sharp and clear, like the first note of a warning. Evelyn met his stare without blinking. Or she said quietly, "You may learn that some doors open both ways." The silence after Evelyn's last words stretched across the courthouse steps like a held breath. Aaron Cole kept his hand near her folder, but he did not touch it again. Something in her voice had changed the air around him. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain, and that certainty unsettled him more than anger ever could. He gave a short laugh, the kind men use when they want to cover a flicker of uncertainty. "You people always talk like that when you have nothing left." Evelyn lowered her chin slightly and looked past him toward the courthouse doors, where people moved in and out with papers in their hands, unaware that the balance of power outside had already shifted. "I would not stand there if I were you," she said. Aaron's jaw tightened. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" "No," she replied. "It is advice." A breeze passed between them, stirring the edge of her coat. For the first time, Aaron noticed the small details he had ignored before: the disciplined stillness in her posture, the way she carried herself like someone accustomed to being obeyed, be heard. He hated that feeling. He hated the feeling of not understanding what he was looking at. "You think a folder and a calm tone make you important," he said. "In this county, I am the one people answer to." Evelyn's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, almost like pity. "Then you should know," she said, "that real authority does not announce itself for attention." Aaron stepped closer, trying to reclaim the moment, trying to push her backward with words if nothing else. "You are standing outside a courthouse acting like you belong here. If you are smart, you will hand me that folder and walk away before you embarrass yourself." Evelyn glanced at the courthouse doors again. A clerk in a gray blazer was speaking quietly to a deputy near the entrance. Two lawyers crossed the steps. A city bus hissed to a stop at the corner. Life kept moving around them, but the tension between Aaron and Evelyn had become its own sealed world. "I am already here," she said. "The only question is whether you are." Aaron gave her a hard stare, then reached for the folder once more. This time, Evelyn did not pull away. She simply opened it halfway and let him glimpse the top page. He saw a heading, a seal, a line of printed text. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of it, and then slowly, the color drained from his face. He stared at the page again as if staring harder might change what he was seeing. Evelyn closed the folder with one smooth motion. "Now," she said, "you may want to listen carefully." Aaron's throat went dry. The world around him seemed to grow quieter, as if even the courthouse had leaned in to hear what came next. Somewhere, inside, another gavel struck once, then again. This time the sound did not feel like warning. It felt like arrival. Evelyn turned her head toward the courthouse entrance and said nothing else. Then from inside the building came the measured sound of footsteps approaching the doors, slow and deliberate, the kind that made people move aside without being asked. Aaron looked up, and for the first time that afternoon his confidence broke. The footsteps grew louder inside the courthouse, measured and unhurried, and every person on the steps seemed to feel them before they could see who was coming. Aaron Cole stood very still, his jaw tight, his eyes moving from Evelyn's face to the closed folder in her hand and back again, as if the truth had become a shape he could not recognize. He had spent most of his career speaking in certainties, giving orders with the ease of a man who believed the room belonged to him, but now the room felt different, smaller, quieter. Not because anyone had raised their voice, but because something larger than his pride had entered the building and was coming closer with every step. Evelyn remained calm. She did not smile. She did not press him. She simply weighted her shoulders, relaxed her gaze steady, as though she had already seen this moment from the beginning and knew exactly how it would end. Aaron forced a breath through his nose and tried to recover the same hard edge he had worn a minute ago. "What is this?" he asked, but the question sounded thinner than he intended. Evelyn tilted the folder slightly, just enough for him to understand that she was still choosing what to reveal and what to keep hidden. "You should have asked that before you spoke to me the way you did," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. It moved through the silence with the kind of authority that did not need permission. From inside the courthouse, the footsteps stopped near the door. There was a pause. Then, the handle turned. Several heads shifted at once. A deputy near the entrance straightened instantly, recognizing something in the way the doors opened, something in the posture of the man who stepped into view. He was dressed neatly. His expression controlled his eyes, taking in the steps, the crowd, the tense stillness in one glance. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The entire front of the courthouse seemed to make room for him without being told. Aaron felt it then, before any name was spoken. The temperature in his chest dropped. His mouth went dry. Evelyn watched the realization begin to form and said nothing because silence was doing more work than words ever could. The man at the door looked directly at her first, and in that brief moment, the atmosphere changed again. It was subtle, but undeniable. Respect moved through the crowd like a current. One officer near the curb lowered his eyes. Another stepped back. Aaron saw the reaction and finally understood that this was not a coincidence, not a bluff, not a desperate attempt to save face. Evelyn had not been nervous because she was weak. She had been patient because she knew the truth had already started walking toward him. The man from the courthouse entrance came down the steps with careful, deliberate steps and stopped beside Evelyn. He did not speak at once. He only looked at Aaron, then at the folder, then back to Evelyn, as if confirming that everything was exactly where it should be. "Aaron Cole," he said at last, and hearing his own name spoken like that made Aaron stiffen. "Do you know who you have been speaking to?" Aaron swallowed hard and tried to answer, but no sound came out. The man did not wait. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a leather wallet. Inside it was a badge, polished and unmistakable. The kind that changed the air in a room the moment it was seen. Around them people held their breath. Even the traffic beyond the courthouse seemed far away now. Aaron stared at the badge, then at Evelyn, and the shape of his mistake became impossible to deny. His face lost its color in slow motion, as if the truth was not merely surprising him but dismantling him piece by piece. Evelyn finally looked at him again, and her expression was not cruel. It was worse. It was calm. "I told you," she said softly. Some doors opened both ways. The man beside her closed his wallet and folded his hands in front of him. "And some people," he added, "should have listened before they spoke." For a long second no one moved. The courthouse stood behind them like a witness that had waited a very long time for the right moment to speak. Then Aaron lowered his eyes, and the confidence he had worn like armor was gone. Not shattered. Just gone. In its place was the awful understanding that the same building he had used to intimidate people was now standing on the side of the truth. That was the moment the lesson began. The courthouse did not feel the same after that moment. The air had changed. People were still standing in the same place under the same gray afternoon light, but the room itself seemed to understand that something had shifted beyond words. Aaron Cole kept looking at Evelyn, waiting for her to become angry, waiting for her to raise her voice, waiting for the kind of reaction he knew how to answer. But she gave him none of that. She simply stood there, with the same calm expression, the folder still in her hand, as if she had all the time in the world, and no need to prove it. That silence unsettled him more than any argument could have. He swallowed once, then looked toward the courthouse doors where the footsteps he had heard a moment earlier were now slowing to a stop. The people nearest the entrance stepped aside without being told. A man in a dark suit appeared first, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to walking into rooms that immediately made space for him. He was older than Aaron had expected, with silver at the temples and a face that did not rush to reveal what it knew. He did not look at Aaron first. He looked at Evelyn. "You kept your composure," he said. His voice even, and measured, the kind of voice that did not need to rise to be obeyed. Evelyn gave a small nod. "I was waiting for the right moment." That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Aaron's throat tightened. He could hear the low murmur spreading through the steps behind him, could feel people recalculating what they had assumed only seconds ago. The man in the suit opened the folder in Evelyn's hand and glanced at its contents with the ease of someone already familiar with every page. Then he turned the folder slightly enough for Aaron to see the letterhead, the signature, the official seal. Aaron did not speak. He could not. The truth was no longer hidden in hints or half-finished sentences. It was standing in front of him, fully formed, patient, and undeniable. The man closed the folder again and held it at his side. "Officer Cole," he said, and the way he used the name made it sound less like a greeting and more like a final review. "You have spent a long time mistaking your authority for wisdom." Aaron tried to respond, but the words would not come together. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time all afternoon he looked young, in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with being seen clearly. Evelyn did not move closer. She did not need to. Her stillness had become its own kind of force. "I never wanted a scene," she said, her tone almost gentle. "I wanted you to understand what you were doing before the consequences reached farther than this step." Behind them, the courthouse doors remained open, and the sound from inside carried outward in a steady flow of footsteps, whispers, and shifting chairs. People were watching now, not with the curiosity of a crowd but with the uneasy attention of witnesses who had realized they were standing at the edge of a turning point. Aaron glanced at the faces around him and saw what he had failed to see all day. No one was afraid of him anymore. Not in the way he had counted on. Not in the way that fed his pride. The man beside Evelyn adjusted his cuff and spoke again quietly. There are always moments when a person can choose to keep going the way he has always gone or stop and finally see the damage he has normalized. Aaron stood frozen, the weight of that sentence pressing into him more deeply than any handcuff ever could. He understood now that this was not about a single mistake. Not really. It was about every glance he had treated like permission, every silence he had mistaken for surrender, every time he had believed rank made him untouchable. And standing there on the courthouse steps with the truth in front of him and a crowd bearing witness, he felt something in him finally give way. Not with noise, not with drama, just a quiet collapse of certainty. Evelyn lowered the folder to her side and looked past him toward the open doors. "That is how justice begins," she said. "Not with fear, with truth." And for the first time, Aaron Cole had nothing left to say. For a long moment, no one on the courthouse steps moved. The gray afternoon light had settled over the building, soft and colorless. And yet the silence felt heavier than any storm. Aaron Cole stood in the same place, shoulders, tight jaw fixed, staring at Evelyn, as if she might still somehow change into the person he had expected her to be. But she did not. She remained calm, composed, and unshaken, her folder resting at her side like a quiet reminder that truth did not need to shout in order to win. Behind her, the open courthouse doors framed the dark interior, and the steady echo of those approaching footsteps seemed to thicken the air with every second. Then the man beside Evelyn stepped forward. He was dressed with the kind of simple authority that did not need decoration. No display. No performance. Just presence. When he spoke, his voice was even controlled and impossible to ignore. "Officer Cole," he said, "you have spent this afternoon making assumptions about a woman you did not bother to understand." Aaron swallowed hard, but said nothing. The man continued, "That is a habit that can become dangerous when a person confuses power with character." The words landed cleanly, one after another, and each one seemed to strip away another layer of Aaron's certainty. He had expected anger. He had expected confrontation. What he was hearing instead was something far more difficult to face. Calm judgment. The kind that did not come from emotion but from seeing everything clearly. Evelyn finally looked at him again, and there was no triumph in her eyes, no cruelty, only a steady sorrow that made the moment feel even more serious. "You wanted me to be smaller," she said. "You wanted me to react in a way that made it easy for you to keep believing what you already decided. But I am not here to fit into your assumptions." Aaron's breathing grew shallow. Around them, people remained still listening. A few had their phones lowered now, no longer recording for spectacle, but holding the moment like something they knew mattered. The courthouse, once used as a backdrop for his confidence, now seemed to stand behind Evelyn and the man beside her, silent and watchful, like it had become part of the witness line itself. The man placed one hand lightly on the side of the folder Evelyn carried, then looked back at Aaron with a face that carried no warmth at all. "There are systems that survive because too many people are afraid to challenge a bad habit," he said. "And there are moments when one honest voice changes that pattern forever." Aaron's throat tightened. He could feel the pressure of the crowd, the weight of the building, the certainty in Evelyn's stillness. For the first time, he understood that what he had called authority had never belonged to him. It had only been borrowed from a uniform, from a position, from other people's silence. And now that silence was gone. The man beside Evelyn reached into his coat, removed a small leather case, and opened it just enough for Aaron to see the outline of credentials that carried more weight than the badge on his own chest. Aaron's face changed instantly. The color drained from it. Not all at once, but in a slow, visible surrender. He looked from the case to Evelyn, and then back again, his mind racing to catch up with what his pride had already lost. Yet even then, Evelyn did not smile. She did not need to. She simply stood there, grounded and unwavering, as if the entire afternoon had been leading to this one quiet fact: truth does not ask for permission to arrive. It simply does. And when it does, every false certainty begins to fall away. The man closed the case and spoke one last time. "You do not need to be afraid of accountability," he said. "You only need to stop hiding from it." Aaron lowered his gaze. The steps, the doors, the faces watching him all seemed to blur together. The weight of the moment settled deep in his chest, and in that stillness he felt the first real crack in the version of himself he had defended for so long. Not because he had been defeated by force, because he had been confronted by truth. And truth, once it stands in the open, has a way of making every lie feel smaller than it ever was. The courthouse steps remained still, but the stillness was no longer empty. It was full, now crowded with the kind of realization that settles into a room after the last lie has been spoken. Evelyn stood where the afternoon light touched the edge of her coat, calm and unhurried, while Aaron Cole looked like a man standing in the ruins of his own certainty. He had expected anger. He had expected fear. He had expected her to flinch, to explain, to lower her eyes the way so many people had done before him. But Evelyn gave him none of that. She simply watched him with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this moment coming long before he ever did. Behind them, the courthouse doors stood open, and the people inside had begun to gather near the entrance, drawn not by spectacle, but by the gravity of what was happening just outside the building that was supposed to protect the truth. A few officers shifted their weight and said nothing. A clerk held a stack of papers against her chest and stared ahead without blinking. Even the air seemed to slow, as if the whole afternoon had learned how to wait. Aaron's mouth opened once, then closed again. Whatever certainty had lived in him was now fighting to survive in smaller and smaller pieces. The man he had been on these steps only minutes ago, the one who had spoken with such ease and leaned on authority as if it belonged to him by birthright, no longer seemed to exist in the same way. In his place was someone quieter, someone listening, someone beginning finally to understand that power does not become truth just because it is spoken loudly. Evelyn took one step forward, and the attention of the entire space seemed to move with her. Her folder remained at her side, but she did not need to lift it to make her point. She had already done that. The documents, the record, the facts, the timeline, all of it had already taken shape in the open air between them. Now there was only the response. Aaron swallowed hard, and for the first time his voice came out thin. "You knew," he said, though it was not really a question. Evelyn did not rush to answer. She let the silence do its work. Then she said, "I knew enough to wait." The words landed quietly, but they carried more weight than anything he had said all day. Because waiting in that moment did not mean weakness. It meant discipline. It meant knowing that truth does not need to chase down the people who fear it. It arrives when it is ready. And once it arrives, it does not leave the same way it came. Aaron stared at her, as if he were trying to find the old version of the moment, the one where he could still control the outcome by force of tone and habit. But nothing about her invited that illusion anymore. Evelyn's posture was steady. Her breathing was even. Her eyes never wavered. She was not performing strength. She was simply standing inside it. Then, from the courthouse doors, the measured voice of a senior clerk called out that the record was being reviewed. Heads turned. People straightened. The phrase moved through the crowd with immediate force, quiet but unmistakable. Review. Record. Evidence. Words that could not be argued with. Forever. Aaron's shoulders tightened, and for a second he looked toward the doors, as if he might still find a side entrance out of the moment. But there was none. The building was no longer a place where he could hide behind rank tone or intimidation. It had become something else entirely. A place where his own conduct was now being measured by the same standards he had once tried to control. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You can keep standing there," she said, "but that will not change what happened." That was the line that finally cut through him. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. Aaron's face changed in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. He had been waiting for someone to challenge him with noise, with panic, with pleading. Instead, he got truth spoken, in a voice that did not tremble. And there was nowhere left for his pride to land. The courthouse steps, the open doors, the silent witnesses, the papers in her hand. All of it came together in one exact and unforgettable pressure point. This was not a scene about winning by volume. It was about a woman who refused to bend when she was expected to disappear, and a man who was finally forced to stand still long enough to see what he had done. Evelyn looked at him one last time, then turned her gaze toward the building behind him, toward the process that was already beginning to move without his permission. "Truth does not need a badge to enter," she said. "It only needs a door that finally opens." The room inside the courthouse had gone so still that even the smallest movement seemed to echo. Aaron Cole stood beneath the harsh overhead lights, with his jaw tight and his hands fixed at his sides, as if he could force the moment to obey him by refusing to move. But nothing in that building belonged to him now. Not the hallway behind him. Not the eyes on him. Not the quiet certainty gathering around Evelyn like a current no one could see, but everyone could feel. She remained calm, her folder held low, her posture steady, her expression unreadable in the way that only true authority can be. She had no need to hurry. Truth never did. It arrived on its own time, and when it did, it asked nothing from anyone except honesty. Aaron swallowed hard, and for the first time the confidence he had leaned on began to look like what it always was. Not strength, not control, only a habit he had mistaken for power. Behind him, the courthouse doors stood open, and the afternoon light spilled across the marble floor in a pale wash that made every face look more exposed, more human, more awake. A clerk near the back lowered her gaze. One of the deputies shifted his weight and said nothing. The silence was not empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of a man realizing the world was no longer arranging itself around his pride. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward him, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not tremble either. "You thought this building would protect you," she said, each word measured and clear. "You thought your title could make the truth wait outside." Aaron looked at her as if he had been forced to hear language in a way he no longer understood. For years, maybe for longer than that, he had treated silence from others as agreement and hesitation as weakness. But now, standing in front of this woman who would not shrink, he could feel the old pattern breaking apart in real time. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Some of the deepest changes in a person begin without spectacle. They begin with the slow, terrible recognition that the story they told themselves was never as strong as they believed. Evelyn took one step forward, and the movement was small, but it changed the air. She was not advancing in anger. She was not there to perform. She was there to finish what had already started the moment the truth entered the room. "People like you always count on fear," she said. "You count on confusion. You count on the hope that if you speak fast enough, no one will notice what is missing." Aaron's expression tightened, but he still said nothing. There was nowhere left for him to hide inside his own excuses. The witnesses around them had gone from cautious to attentive, as if they were all listening for the exact second a lie would finally stop breathing. Evelyn glanced toward the open doors, where the courthouse steps waited in the soft gray light. That building had seen power used as a weapon for too long. Now it was beginning to learn a different language. "The truth does not ask for permission," she said. "It does not wait for the right mood, the right crowd, or the right man to approve it. It stands. That is all it ever needs to do." Aaron's face changed. Then not in anger, but in that deeper, more painful way. A person changes when the mind finally catches up to the damage the heart has been trying to deny. He had not been undone by force. He had been undone by reality, and there is no armor for that. The folder in Evelyn's hand looked suddenly heavier, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. Every page was a record. Every line was a witness. Every fact was a nail in the coffin of the story he had tried to build around himself. Outside, a breeze moved through the doorway and stirred the edge of her coat, but she did not flinch. She had already crossed the distance that mattered. The rest was only consequence. Aaron stared at her, then at the papers, then at the building around them, as though he were seeing the courthouse for the first time and discovering it had never belonged to him at all. Evelyn's voice softened, but it did not lose its strength. "You do not get to decide who deserves dignity," she said. "You do not get to decide whose truth matters. That choice was never yours." And in that moment, the last piece of his pride gave way, not with a crash, with a quiet collapse. The kind that leaves a person standing upright while everything inside them changes shape. Evelyn held his gaze a second longer, then turned her attention toward the officers, the clerk, the door, the process already moving forward without his consent. "This is what justice looks like," she said almost to the room itself. "Not perfection. Not noise. Just truth finally being allowed to stand where it was always meant to stand. I can help write this in a cinematic YouTube-safe style, but I cannot continue a story built around racist abuse or degrading a protected group. If you want, I can rewrite Part 8 as a justice courtroom scene with the same tension reveal and emotional payoff, while removing the harmful racial framing." The courthouse had begun to breathe again, slowly and carefully, as if the building itself had been holding its breath for too long and was only now learning how to let it go. Footsteps returned first, then the low murmur of voices, then the soft shuffle of papers, as people remembered they were part of a process that had nearly been swallowed by fear. Evelyn Hart remained near the front of the room, her posture calm, her hands folded with the same quiet steadiness she had carried through every moment of the day. Aaron Cole stood a few feet away, still rigid, still pale, as though his body had not yet accepted that the ground beneath him had changed. He kept looking toward the clerk, toward the judge, toward the table where the records lay open in plain view, and each glance seemed to remind him that the truth was no longer something he could delay. It was already here. It had entered the room, taken its seat, and begun speaking in a voice that could not be crossed out. Evelyn did not rush him. She did not need to. Time had already done what pressure could not. It had stripped away the illusion that confidence alone could protect a false story forever. One by one, the people in the room started to understand that the case was no longer about who had spoken the loudest or who had tried hardest to control the moment. It was about what could be proven, what could be documented, and what had been waiting patiently in the open all along. Aaron swallowed hard and stared at the sealed file on the table, as if it might somehow change shape and save him from what it contained. But files do not bend for pride. Records do not apologize. Paper has no loyalty except to the facts written on it. And facts, once seen clearly, have a way of making every excuse look smaller than a whisper. Evelyn finally stepped forward, not with triumph, but with the kind of composure that comes only after being underestimated too many times to count. She looked at the room, then at the judge, then at the people seated behind the rail who had watched the entire exchange in silence. "What happened here was never about power," she said evenly. "It was about whether power would be allowed to outrun truth." Her words settled over the courtroom without force, without drama, and yet they carried farther than any raised voice ever could. Even Aaron seemed unable to interrupt them. He stood there, absorbing each sentence, like a man hearing his own reflection speak back to him for the first time. For a brief moment, the room felt less like a battleground and more like a place of reckoning. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Reckoning. The difference mattered. Because revenge seeks to wound, but reckoning seeks to reveal. And once revelation begins, denial has very little room left to hide. The judge glanced down at the documents again, then back up, her expression measured but no longer uncertain. The clerk moved quietly to one side, prepared now to continue the record. A deputy near the door straightened his jacket and looked away, as if realizing that the most important thing in the room was not authority at all, but the responsibility that comes after authority fails. Evelyn's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "Truth does not need to shout to be real," she said. "It only needs the chance to remain standing when everything false has been asked to leave." Aaron closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them again, whatever confidence had once carried him was gone. What remained was a man forced to meet the cost of his own choices, without the shelter of titles, uniforms, or borrowed certainty. Outside the courthouse, The afternoon light had shifted toward evening, turning the windows gold and amber. Inside, the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of intimidation. It was the silence that follows the moment. A lie can no longer survive the room. Evelyn turned slightly toward the exit, then paused, not looking back with anger, but with a steadiness that felt heavier than anger ever could. "Justice," she said almost gently, "does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with a document, a witness, and the courage to let the truth remain visible long enough for everyone to finally see it." And in that stillness, as the courthouse prepared to move forward without Aaron's permission, the room understood what had changed forever. The law had not become weaker. It had simply stopped pretending that fear was the same thing as control.